So what can we do with our new color palette asset once it's inside of our assets folder? Well, right now, not much because there's nothing for us to configure. Let's go back into our scripts folder, open up the color palette, and begin adding the properties we'll need in order to create the palette itself. To get started, we're going to want to import a new namespace. Let's copy the Systems Collections and below it, add generic to the end of it. We're going to create two lists that'll represent the palette of the default colors on the texture and the new palette we want to map it to. We also are going to need a reference to the source texture that we're editing. So below our static method where we create our color palette, let's add these new properties. Here we'll start with the public texture 2D and we'll call this source. Next, we'll create our two lists. The first will be a public list typed to color, and we'll call this palette. And we'll create a new color list for palette. Now let's copy this line and paste it below. And in this case, we'll call this new palette. Again, it'll be a new list with colors. Now, let's save this and take a look at what happens when we go back into the editor. If we go into our artwork folder and we select our color palette, you'll see that we now have all the properties we just added. We can add a source file. We have an array of colors. If we were to change this, here it'll automatically fill out and we could select different colors. And we'll have the new palette as well. As we continue to build this out, these two will always be in sync. If there are 6 colors in the palette, there'll be 6 colors in the new palette. Next, let's look at how we can pre-populate this color palette with the texture we're going to want to sample colors from. We'll go back into MonoDevelop. And here, once we create our new palette, we're going to want to give it a reference to the source that we're going to be editing. Here we'll type out new palette, source, and we'll simply pass in a reference to the selected texture. Now, let's save our script and go back into Unity. Of course, this isn't going to work retroactively. We're going to have to delete our existing palette, and let's create a new one. Now that we've created the new color palette, you'll see here, source has now been populated. This is a really good technique to know because anytime we create a new instance of a scriptable object, we can configure it in the same static method that we call in our custom menu. So if you have other settings and stuff that you want to create on a scriptable object, use this to pre-populate it as much as possible. When building your own custom tools, you want to build as much in as possible and automate it so that you don't have to sit there and do it by hand. Now, in the next video, we'll start sampling the colors from the texture we selected.